day meets the eye.
I see your true colors, and that's why I love you so.
So far, the Master System's 1986 library has generally drawn from the same playbook as the NES, offering experiences similar to those you would find on Nintendo's console, albeit usually with nicer graphics. For F-16 Fighting Falcon, however, the system moves into new territory. Here we have a flight and combat simulator that pits an American F-16 fighter against Soviet MiGs, all viewed from an in-cockpit perspective that reduces everything down to wireframes and simple sprites. Originally developed by American studio Nexa, who would later expand the game into a full franchise called Falcon, F-16 Fighting Falcon debuted on the MSX in 1984 and was later ported to Sega's console. According to multiple sources including Moby Games and SegaRetro, this conversion happened under the watchful eye of programmer Yuji Naka, and that is why Yuji Naka is now in jail. Okay, that's mean. The blame for this version doesn't really lay at his feet. He had to work with the existing material. But let there be no question about it, his port of F-16 Fighting Falcon turned out to be one of the strangest games ever to ship for Sega Master System. Outside of its colorful title screen, this release gives off a distinct SG-1000 vibe. From the color palette, to the monochromatic sprites, to the choppy animation, everything about this Sega card suggests an SG-1000 release running incognito as a Master System game. That approach isn't entirely unheard of. 1987's graphical adventure, Sherlock Holmes Loretta no Shozo for SG-1000 appeared in packaging that positioned it as a Mark III release, from the Mark III style white cartridge to the box's gold cartridge branding. Now, unlike Loretta no Shozo, F-16 Fighting Falcon doesn't run on stock SG-1000 hardware. The title screen includes far too much detail and variety to function without horrible color clash on SG-1000. And tech-focused Sega blogger Nicole Express confirms that the game takes advantage of the Master System's additional memory over the SG-1000, meaning it can't run on the older console even if you were to jump past the title screen. However, once you move beyond the title screen, F-16 Fighting Falcon does kick the Master System into SG-1000 graphical compatibility mode, restricting it to the color palette and sprite restrictions of the other console. To my knowledge, this is the only Master System or Mark III release ever to operate like this. It reminds me a little bit of RPM Racing for Super NES, the only release ever to run entirely in the console's high-resolution mode. An early game for a new piece of hardware that explored a sort of technological edge case that no one else bothered to tinker with, probably because it ended up not being very good. This also makes F-16 Fighting Falcon one of only 2 Master System games that won't boot on the Sega Genesis Power-Base converter, along with the PAL-exclusive Master System port of Probe's Alien 3. As a 1992 release, Alien 3 probably made use of features too advanced to work on the Power-Base converter. F-16 Fighting Falcon, on the other hand, lacks compatibility because it relies on technology too primitive, as the Power-Base converter doesn't support SG-1000 software. How did this Sega card turn out to be such a bizarre and unique entry in the system's library? If I were to guess, and that's really all I can do, since no one has ever bothered to quiz the original developers about this release in any depth, I'd wager that Sega originally intended to release F-16 Fighting Falcon as an SG-1000 title. In Japan, the game shipped in March 1986, at which point the SG-1000 was, well, going strong would be a stretch, but certainly it hadn't died yet. Had it shipped then for the SG-1000, it would have reached store shelves alongside Ninja Princess and Super Tank, putting it half a year ahead of key releases for the system like Wonder Boy and The Castle. Since F-16 Fighting Falcon originated on MSX, which amounted to a beefier version of the SG-1000 hardware, a cross-platform port made sense. But with the more powerful Mark III having become available, I can imagine Naka convincing the higher-ups to let him create a less compromised port of the game by releasing it for the new hardware in its compatibility mode, which would allow him to retain the MSX code and graphics while gaining access to more RAM to put it on similar footing to the source material. After all, the MSX's primary advantage over the SG-1000 mounted to its more ample supply of memory. An SG-1000 origin story would also scan, given the ways in which F-16 Fighting Falcon appears to lean into the SC-3000, the home computer version of SG-1000. This makes sense, again, given that the MSX blurred the line between console and computer, and F-16 Fighting Falcon took advantage of this fact by incorporating a control scheme far too complex for the Master System's 2-button controller to recreate. While the game obviously can't run on an SC3000, since it can't run on SG1000, the Japanese version does take advantage of the Mark III's support for the SK1100 keyboard, which connected to the console through an IDE ribbon cable that the Master System lacks an interface for. However, plug an SK1100 into a Mark III, and you can play F-16 Fighting Falcon as a fairly traditional flight and combat sim, with keys to control more than a dozen different combat functions. On top of that, F-16 Fighting Falcon makes use of another wholly unique feature found in no other Master System or Mark III game. Unbelievably, SMS Power claims it offered 2-player support on linked consoles, which you could enable by connecting the SK1100 keyboards of 2 Mark III systems to one another with a special link cable that ran between the printer ports on both keyboards. It's difficult to imagine this feature seeing any real-world use, and I'm not aware of any other game that supported it, but it really ranks up there with booting a Game Boy cartridge into the Super NES ROM of Space Invaders in terms of weird retro console party tricks. None of this makes any difference to the American, European, and other international releases of the game, since the Master System lacks support for the SK1100 for inputs and strange connectivity gimmicks. For us, F-16 Fighting Falcon amounted to a sadly solo experience, and a very cumbersome one. To properly play the game, you need to wrestle with 2 Master System gamepads. Controller 1 features the primary inputs, pitch and yaw, and weapon system toggling and firing commands, while Controller 2 allows you to activate features like your afterburner and electronic countermeasures to break an enemy missile lock. Fittingly, the game comes with one of the largest manuals on the system, an amusing juxtaposition given that the chunky instruction book comes packed in with a tiny Sega card. The manual text addresses the players with a sarcastic tone, which I suppose is meant to evoke the vibe of military flight instruction, but mostly just comes off as dickish. Overall, it's kind of a mess. F-16 Fighting Falcon attempts to do a lot with the Master System and Mark III hardware, and you do have to respect that level of ambition. But ambition does not always make for a fun game. No, the game itself feels pretty mundane. A hybrid flight sim and arcade combat title. The original release predates Sega's own Afterburner, a straight-up arcade combat game, by 3 years, but it may as well be 3 generations of hardware if you want to compare the two. You need to fly sorties against Russian MiG-25s, gunning them down in order to reach the next mission. There's no continue or password system here, so as seems to be increasingly par for the course on Master System, blowing a single mission means you need to start the whole thing all over again. The controls have an unreasonably touchy feel that sends you whirling away in the wrong direction unless you feather the D-pad, and lining up enemy fighters for a shot feels almost like an exercise in futility. Even the early missions make it almost impossible to land a hit with your nose turret, and that's with the MiGs basically just sitting there waiting for you to gun them down. I can't imagine how much more difficult things become once you reach the more advanced missions where they take a more aggressive approach. Still, I don't think we should write off F-16 Fighting Falcon as a complete loss. As one of Naka's first professional programming projects, it undoubtedly gave him a chance to pore over someone else's 3D code and get a sense of how to go about things a year later for those Phantasy Star dungeons. And hey, if nothing else, F-16 Fighting Falcon makes you better appreciate the Master System version of Afterburner. Sure, the console couldn't recreate superscalar effects very well, but at least you have a glimpse of how much worse it could have been. You know how Hudson published Tekkon's Star Force in Japan, and then ripped it off to spin it into its own derivative series, Star Soldier? That's kind of what Sega did here with TransBot for Master System. Well, almost. TransBot for Master System more or less adapts an arcade game called Astro Flash. The two games differ pretty significantly in a lot of respects, beyond being horizontal shooters, which both involve a fighter that can turn into a bipedal robot. But since the Japanese Mark III card hit stores under the name Astro Flash, you have to look at TransBot as a wildly overhauled home conversion rather than a spiritually similar work. It's another one of those Sega card releases where the developers seem to have made tweaks to the content for no good reason. TransBot doesn't feel as badly compromised as My Hero, thankfully, but Astro Flash in arcades was so good that the revisions can't help but chafe. The original Astro Flash did something amazing. It finally made good on the transforming robot concept. We've seen quite a few games that involve turning a fighter into a humanoid mech already, including Macross, Formation Z, and Volgarde 2. And all of them have shared one thing in common. You had almost no incentive to switch out of fighter mode in any of those games, because the robot's large hitbox and clumsy maneuvering sucked the fun out of the action. Even in Astro Flash's direct antecedent, Orguss for SG-1000, you really only ever wanted to change into robot form at the end of each stage when you had to pump firepower into the so-called vibration device at the end to complete the level. But not in Astro Flash. Sega solved the problem of transforming fighters in Astro Flash by presenting players with a simple proposition. The robot form may have been larger and slower than the fighter, but it also had way more firepower. Where the ship format allowed you to fire a narrow burst of bullets straight ahead, the robot commanded an impressive three-way spread attack. Not only that, but every time you gunned down a foe in either form, you'd feed a power bar at the bottom of the screen, which would level up at different increments and boost the effectiveness of your attacks in both forms. It made for a breezy, fairly low-friction shooter that incentivized players to experiment with the transformation feature to see which form worked best against different enemy formations. TransBot unfortunately does almost none of that. On Master System, players completely lose their agency over the transformation feature, and the power bar takes on a wildly different function. See, TransBot locks you into your fighter form, except on the rare occasion that you win the lottery. As you gun down foes, you don't build up a power meter. Instead, taking out enemies causes a vehicle to appear along the ground, riding from one end of the screen to the other. Blowing it up will release a question mark icon that activates a roulette at the top of the screen. When you press what should be your transformation button, you'll cause the roulette to stop on a letter from A to G. Depending the letter you stop on, you'll activate a different power-up for your ship. Some of these simply enhance your basic forward cannon. A ring laser, a piercing missile, an incredible ultra-wide sword beam that can clear an enemy formation in a single shot. Other icons, however, activate weapons that also cause your ship to transform into its robot form, including a bidirectional beam and the arcade's triple spread. You don't have a lot of direct control over which powers you activate because the roulette cycles between letters quickly, and only a couple of these letters allow you to turn into your robot form, which sort of misses the point of the game's entire title and gimmick. Even more disappointingly, the game punishes you for seeking out the best weapons, or even for using weapons. Each weapon has a limited amount of energy that you expend every time you fire it, and once it's out of juice, your fighter reverts back to the mundane default icon A, a single forward shot. But if you don't gun down enemies, you'll never properly complete the game. As it turns out, TransBot will loop infinitely if you simply play haphazardly, seek out the most advantageous power-ups, or focus on evasion in order to conserve weapon power. In order to reach the enemy's underground base and destroy the evil machine behind whatever flimsy excuse for a plot powers the action, you have to take out a pair of unspecified enemies, which in turn can only be destroyed with a single unspecified weapon type. The manual and game don't explain this, and you might never even realize that an underground base and boss exist if not for the attract mode that shows them off. Instead, you're only told that you need to meet certain conditions in order to enter the base. Those conditions turn out to be using the piercing missile, icon D, to take out the two aforementioned enemies. If you shoot those enemies with any other weapon, they'll take no damage and simply counterattack by firing a spread of bullets at you. Only by blasting through them with the missile can you safely destroy them and reveal the base entrance. Like my hero's overly aggressive mobs, this feels like an attempt to pad the gameplay at the expense of playability. The base sequences aren't amazing, but you do get to fight a boss that looks so much like a Star Wars Scout Walker that it's a miracle Sega wasn't sued. So that's something. TransBot ends up being a little bit of a letdown. It's fine if generic, but it could have been great if Sega had stuck more closely to Astro Flash's mechanics. Instead, TransBot makes significant changes to the game that don't feel like a matter of technical necessity. The Master System could have recreated the arcade mechanics just fine. Sometimes it's best not to overthink things. I wish that the developers behind TransBot had better appreciated the fact they'd been handed a game that worked just fine as it was. Move over Grand Prix world. Now there's a game that scrambles the word order of your title. It's World Grand Prix. Although World Grand Prix wore the title The Circuit in Japan, the connection to GP World seems hard to deny. This is simply a faster, smoother, and way more challenging take on the same material that had previously appeared on SG-1000. Of course, we're talking about a Grand Prix game here, so you have to expect a certain amount of commonality, just given the limitations of the genre. You drive a car in a very wobbly circle, attempting to avoid crashes, and seeking to hit a target time. Voila. But World Grand Prix uses a heads-up display and gearshift system that call back directly to the SG-1000 game. And as with the earlier release, it also includes a track editor that allows you to build your own course and race on it. That said, this is a much harder take on Grand Prix racing than that seen in GP World. I don't know that I'd call that game a cakewalk, but World Grand Prix further establishes Sega's philosophy when it comes to balancing Master System software. Learning curves are for babies. Games should assault players at their maximum difficulty right from the outset. Certainly World Grand Prix lets you know what you're in for from the start. The only curves here are the hairpins on the tracks. Or rather track, because good luck making it to the second track without ample practice. The first race opens with a display that gives you two pieces of information. One, the world record time for the course, and two, the time that you need to beat in order to qualify for the second race. These numbers are the same. World Grand Prix establishes its expectations right here. If you want to progress, you'd better be the literal best damn racer in the world. The challenges you face once the starting timer counts down should be instantly familiar to anyone who played GP World or any other SG-1000 racer. The act of driving itself feels great here, but it's complicated by an endless array of cars whose drivers attempt to prevent you from advancing by drifting to cut you off. This manages to be vastly more hectic here than it was in any SG-1000 title. Not every car will drift into you, so a big part of the challenge amounts to guessing which cars will drift and which ones will stay in their lane. You dare not touch another car, or even come close to one thanks to the sloppy oversized hitboxes, because approaching another vehicle will cause yours to instantly explode. You also need to stick to the pavement because brushing the road's shoulders usually ends up being fatal. Signs and other obstacles appear alongside the road, but their placement will cause you to collide with them if your wheels even slightly extend into the red and white patterned sidewall of the road when a sign streaks past. Because World Grand Prix moves at such a blindingly fast clip, and you need to haul ass if you want to have the slightest hope of making the target time, you end up having very little time to react to the movement of oncoming cars. You almost have to go on instinct, or perhaps memorization, in order to scoot safely past rival vehicles. It doesn't help that the game loves to spawn two cars at a time near corners and tight turns in order to box you in. Seemingly every bend in the road involves steering between two tightly placed cars and trying to predict how they're going to respond to you. And these high speeds mean you have little reaction time. I'm sure European viewers are licking their chops and thinking about how awesome this sounds, but as an American, I am genetically incapable of dealing with Grand Prix racing, and have accepted that I will never actually see the game's other 11 tracks, all of which appear to have been based on real-world racetracks despite not using proper names. Sorry, European friends, you have fun. I'm gonna wait for Outrun. Next time on Segaiden, you are already dead.